We also like to welcome our live stream audience. Over 300 people are seeing us live stream. We're glad you're here. And we are being joined for the missiology lectures. And I am told to look at the camera again. No, I don't see no camera. All of these instructions get me all confused. Now, this conference is crucial precisely for the message that we just heard in the beautiful poetic manner that Mark Chase presented to us. And we are glad that the community that has been welcomed are here, and those in Peyton Hall as well. And we pray that all of this effort and all of these prayers and all of these words will become movement, will become hands, will become more than thoughts. And we are particularly happy to tell you that we have the translation into Korean and Spanish. This is a beta version, and it is on the screen. And there are other instructions that you could ask one of the ushers if you are not following and if you need help. We have volunteers that will hand out Q&A cards to write your questions, and they will be collected after the presentation. And now let's give a hand to Dr. Love L. Sechrest, who will be the one introducing our speaker for tonight.
Thank you so much, Johnny, for allowing me this pleasure of introducing two friends of mine. You are all here to hear Dr. Willie Jennings, who is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale University Divinity School. He is the author of The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, the winner of the American Academy of Religion Award of Excellence in the Study of Religion in 2011, and winner of the Grawemeyer Award for Outstanding Work in the Field of Religion in 2015. This is a coveted award that is given to a book that the selection committee thinks can change the world. I knew him as the academic dean at Duke Divinity, where he served from 1994 to 2006. I had just arrived on campus to start my PhD, and somehow I had missed out on the information where someone was supposed to tell me that a PhD was going to take 7 years. And the dean's office called and said that the dean wanted me to come into his office. And I'm like, oh my God, they already found out that I don't belong here. But I remember going into his office, and it was like this oasis of peace and calm. There was this beautiful music playing. There was incense. So all of the senses were involved. There was art, all these books, and just the calm presence of Dr. Jennings. Pictures of drawings by his two girls on the desk. I hadn't done anything wrong. He just wanted to model for me that his door was always open. He is an incredibly generous person. He has the spiritual fruit of generosity. By the time I graduated 6 years later, I found out that he had that same level of generosity for everyone in the place, the master's students, the doctoral students, the local pastors, the local activists, who else am I missing? Oh, right, faculty. He was always making their lives better, helping faculty be more productive, helping students to fund their educations, finding grants to help them succeed. By the time he stepped down as the dean, the Divinity School realized that they had to replace him with 3 separate people. He is still mentoring leaders all over the world. There is now a Jennings School of Theological Reflection on the problem of race. And though I'm in biblical studies, I nevertheless count myself in that number. I was once asked by a leading theologian whose name you would recognize. They asked me to tell them who I thought was the most influential theologian on my own development. I knew what the answer was supposed to be. I was supposed to give him his name back. I lost that job. But I describe him to my students as the foremost African-American theologian on the planet. When I Googled his name just now, just to make sure that I had all my facts about him, I didn't find anything else. I know him well. But there was this thing on the bottom of the Google page, right? It says, people also search for Miroslav Volf, James Cone, and Stanley Hauerwas. He is an artist with words and on a saxophone and has a heart big enough for 3 normal people and then some. Willie Jennings will be speaking to us on the topic of can white people be saved? Reflections on the relationship to missions and whiteness. I'm going to introduce Mark Labberton, who will come up after Dr. Jennings. My friendship with Mark Labberton is of shorter duration. We met in 2007 when he was interviewing for the Lloyd John Ogilvie Chair in Preaching. Or I should really say that he had graciously agreed to come listen to our pleas that he would come and take the job. Mark was leaving over 30 years in the pastorate, and seminaries all over the nation were vying for the opportunity to have him join their faculty. And I was so impressed at that first meeting that this was a man with a living faith and a breadth of vision that I had seldom seen before. I pride myself as a leader, and one of the gifts that the Spirit has given me is the ability to discern leadership in others. And I just know that when he walked out of that interview, we said to each other, wow, could it be that God has just sent us Fuller's next president? And in 2013, the Fuller trustees validated that our insight was from the Lord and installed him as Fuller's 5th president. We have gotten to work closely at times, and I have stories. But though others are often mentioned, including myself, when we tell the story about Fuller's past recent major curriculum change, what is seldom told is the fact that the most innovative part of that curriculum was a direct result of Mark's deep heart for the formation of God's leaders in the church, starting from the inside out. I know him as a man of great spirituality, great faith, and deep wisdom. You will be blessed to hear Dr. Mark Labberton. This is a conversation I have been waiting for a year and a half.
Thank you, Dr. Sechrest, to you and Dr. Young and Dr. Ramirez Johnson and President Labberton. Thank you all so much for this wonderful invitation to be here. I bring you, dear friends, warmest greetings from the faculty, the staff, and the dean of Yale Divinity School, where we, like you, labor every day not to simply understand the world, but to change it. I am thrilled to be here at this wonderful conference, and thrilled to be with the other panelists and respondents. I have learned so much being here, and I am very excited to be in the presence of these women and men who are thinking deep thoughts and doing very important things. May I just take a moment to lift up one of the panelists. She doesn't know I'm going to do this, but this morning we were blessed to hear Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Condi Frazier. And I told her that I never meant Mary McLeod Bethune, but she is Mary McLeod Bethune. And if you've never been to Esperanza College, you really need to go and see the incredible work that she is doing and the faculty and staff are doing there. And I am always honored to be in the presence of greatness. And so, Dr. Connie Frazier, thank you especially. I am proud of my alma mater. I am a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary back in the day. Back when I had hair. And that was a long time ago. But I'm thrilled that Fuller is doing this. You know, not many seminaries could have a conference like this. And so I am thankful that at this crucial moment, Fuller is doing what Fuller can do. This is an exciting time, sisters and brothers. It's a very exciting time. It's a very dangerous time, but an exciting time because the Spirit of God is moving us into alignment with what the Spirit wants to do if we would just have the courage to do what the Spirit wants us to do. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to get right to this. They've let me know that the clock is on me, and you know, we Baptist preachers, we don't like clocks, so we're gonna do the best we can to reconcile with this clock. So, sisters and brothers, a question this evening, a question for us this evening. Can white people be saved? Can white people be saved? For some, the question that titles this presentation sounds deeply offensive. It suggests that there is a category of people whose existence raises the question of the efficacy of salvation. The efficacy of salvation, as you all know, is a very complicated theological ideal involving not just one's status in eternity, as many great evangelists would say, but also the quality and character of one's Christian commitment. And not only these matters, but also the nature of the redemptive dynamic of a life. That is, the level of depth of one's deliverance from captivity or bondage. Now, at this moment, I am less concerned about the efficacy of salvation with the question and more interested in the status of two key words: salvation and whiteness. Salvation and whiteness. These terms point to a history that we yet live within, a history where whiteness as a way of being in the world has been parasitically joined to a Christianity that is also a way of being in the world. It was the fusion of these two realities that gave tragic shape to Christian faith in the New Worlds at the dawn of what we now call the modern colonialist era, or as scholars like to call colonial modernity. It is precisely this fusing together of Christianity with whiteness that constitutes the ground of many of our struggles today. The struggle against aggressive nationalism is the struggle against the fusion of Christianity and whiteness. The struggle against racism and white supremacy and some aspects of sexism and patriarchy is the struggle against this fusion. The struggle against the exploitation of the planet is bound up in the struggle against this joining. So many people today see these problems of planetary exploitation, of racism, of sexism, of nationalism, and so forth, but they do not see the deeper problem of this fusion, which means they have not yet grasped the energy that drives many of our problems. We have always had difficulty in seeing the deeper problem of this fusion. On the one hand, many people have not been able to see this as a fusion, a joining that should have never happened. Many people collapse Christianity and whiteness into just one thing: loved or hated. They cannot see two things, two mutually interpenetrating realities, the one always performing itself inside the other. Always performing itself inside the other. On the other hand, there are just as many people who do not see this as a deep problem or even as a problem at all. They have made whiteness an irreversible accident of history, or even, dare I say, an attribute of creation. That whiteness is a problem remains an elusive point to get across because too many people have no idea what to do with such an idea. Beside bewilderment, the typical responses I get to the idea that whiteness is a problem is a mixture of guilt and anger and, of course, the inevitable pushback. I want to return to these important emotions a little later. It is an ironic truth of Christian faith that most people perform a faith, embody a faith far more complex than they articulate. There, sisters and brothers, is a vastness to our faith, our lives in faith, that we cannot adequately capture with our words. And the difficulty with racial existence, and with whiteness in particular, is that it is woven itself into that vastness. Making seeing the fusion and seeing our way beyond the fusion very difficult work. So my presentation aims to aid us in the work of ending the fusion of whiteness and Christianity. To speak of whiteness is not to speak of particular people, but of people caught up in a deformed building project aimed at bringing the world to its full maturity. What does maturity look like? Maturity of mind and body, land and animal use, landscape and building, family and government. Whiteness, my sisters and brothers, is a horrific answer to this question, formed exactly at the site of Christian missions. So in this presentation, I want to explore whiteness as a deformed formation toward maturity. Whiteness as a deformed formation toward maturity, and along the way, to consider some of its emotional dimensions. And finally, at the very end, since I don't have much time, to suggest how we might begin to separate whiteness from Christianity by forming places, concrete places that offer a different building project toward maturity. But before we turn to these matters, let me raise a couple of questions that some will want addressed right away. I've done this before. First question everybody asks. Have I already made whiteness too important? Made matters of racial identity too decisive? This is a fair question if it is asked from a position where the history and the continuing influence of the West and of Christianity has only been and continues to be tangential at best. But if I am inside the story of modern Christianity, then I am inside the story of racial identity. And if I am inside a faith confessed or a social and economic order performed that echoes down the centuries from the colonial shores or homes of the masters of the old world of Europe, then I am inside the story of whiteness, whether I know it or see it or not. Another related question often asked at this moment is whether a focus on whiteness obscures the voices and visions of all those people designated non-white, especially designated black? Does focusing on whiteness continue the tragic history of making the minds, actions, and decisions of Europeans and their descendants central to our imaginations and our actions? In short, does this focus continue to undermine non-white agency, both historically and existentially? This, too, is a fair question if it is asked with a view toward the struggle of so many peoples in the world right now to be heard and taken seriously. But if we want to understand what finding voice and forming life-sustaining vision means at this moment, then we have to understand how whiteness informs the intellectual, artistic, economic, and geographic stage on which vision and voice are realized and performed. Moreover, my sisters and brothers, both these important questions have not yet reckoned with the reality of creaturely entanglement. We have always lived in an enmeshed world where lives are intertwined and constantly and continuously interweaving. It was and is a mistake. It was and is a mistake to ever imagine separate but equal existence. Don't drink that poison. It is one thing to imagine the voice and vision of a people being heard and seen. It is an entirely different matter to imagine voice and vision existing alone, singularly, or in competition with other voices.
Right now, Pastor.
Even if it could be imagined in the past, it certainly cannot be and should not be imagined now. Yet even in the past, separate existence was never realized as sequestered existence. We are joined at the site of the dirt.
Yes.
And the dirt is our kin. The dirt is our kin. From dust we came, and to dust we will return. We are of the dirt. The dirt. Even geographic distance and the difference of strange tongues cannot thwart this truth. We are creatures bound together. But it was precisely this recognition and the historic resistance to it that showed itself so powerfully in the emergence of whiteness. Whiteness, as we now know it and experience it, emerged at a moment in human history when the world in all its epistemological density was opening up to those we would later call Europeans. It began simply as an impulse. Early Europeans entered worlds overwhelming in every way, not only the majestic beauty, but also the stunning landscapes, not just the inexplicable animals in their mind-bending variety, but the vast array of different languages carried by different peoples, similar but different. These early Europeans in these new places asked themselves the question, who am I in this strange new place? Who am I in this strange new place? This is the right question. This is the right question, the holy and good question. It's the question you should always ask when you're in a new place. Who am I in this new place? The newness of place should always invoke such questions. The question is never the root of selfishness. Selfishness grows from its answer. These early Europeans answered the question without the voice and vision of the peoples of the New World. They self-designated. They self-designated. That was bad enough, but the horror continued as they designated vast numbers of remarkably different peoples. As they did this, They quickly began to suture different peoples, clans, tribes into racial categories. They, the Europeans, were white, and the others almost white, not quite white, non-white, or almost black, not quite black or black. They also created a virile world of designation, between white and black. It's never just about white and black. White and black are the frames within which you can designate others. Between white and black, capable of capturing all people in racial identity. What began, we should say, as harmless designating, soon took its place in a matrix of harm. In that matrix of harm, these categories took on an aggressive life of their own. As I had noted elsewhere in print, the work of Proto-Europeans naming themselves white and others non-white was only one side of what constituted racial identity. The other crucial part of that constitution was the formation of private property. The formation of private property and the destruction of place-centered identities. Race and place have always been together. For the first time in human history, peoples, especially in the colonized worlds, would be forced to think themselves in disorienting ways, to think themselves away from land and away from animals, and into racial encasement, into races. They were forced to reduce their identities down to their bodies and the activities of their body. Why? Because the land was being taken. The animals were being captured and killed at a monstrous rate. And the plants and the landscape were being altered irreversibly. These Christian settlers understood themselves to be present in the new worlds only by the hand of God, only through God's ineffable providence. They were there for one central purpose, to bring the new worlds to maturity, mature use, mature development, and of course, a mature perception of the world. As the taking of land and animal was being done, European Christians challenged to its core the vision shared by many native peoples and many peoples that both their identities and their sense of well-being formed and flourished through constant interaction with specific places and animals. They were not simply in a place and with animals. They were not simply on land. The place was in them, and they were within the animals, sharing life and vision, joined together as family. Such a vision for most missionaries was demonically inspired confusion. Later in time to be called by others animism. And still later, to be called cultural primitivism. In place of this vision, the real one, the one closer to the truth, these Christians installed the conceptual building block we live in to this day. That is, of a world that revolves around a centered white self, a body that projects meaning onto the world, onto land and animals, through reductive forms of naming, designating, classifying, analyzing, and summarizing the nature of being and the beings of nature. There was a central reason for the emergence of the new self, It was necessary in order to bring nature and human beings to maturity, to the full realization of their purpose and their use. So the pedagogical goal of missionaries and others was not simply to bring New World peoples into the reality of salvation, but as fundamental to their salvation, to change their ways of seeing the world so that they too would see themselves as rightly centered selves who project meaning onto the world and who may bring nature to its full purpose and use. This crucial educational hope was to disabuse native peoples of any idea that their lands and their animals, landscapes and seasons carried any communicative, or animate density. Another way to say that is that they wanted to disabuse them of the idea that the world speaks and that they have to listen. And therefore, if the world speaks and we have to listen, there might be ethical and moral direction for how to live in the world. If the world speaks, and we're able to listen. If God has placed in the world a voice, and we have to listen. Instead, they offered peoples a relationship with the world that was basically one-dimensional. We interpret and manipulate the world as we see fit, taking from it what we need and caring for it only within the logics of making it more productive for us. That is, we draw the world into its proper fulfillment. Now, this is crudely put, but it captures the trajectory of how humanity's imperial position as stewards of the creation was most often interpreted in colonial contexts. The whole world in this way of thinking was framed temporally, always in need of being moved from its potential to its full realization, potentiality to actuality, as Thomas put it. This way of perceiving the world, as the great Native American religious scholar Vine Deloria Jr. said, it drained the world of its spatial realities, drained the spatial realities of life of any real significance. Native peoples, he said, were forced to think their lives temporally and not spatially. The Western Christianity they received taught them this crucial lesson that you and I have accepted as gospel truth. Where you live temporally, that is, where you are going, moving, developing toward, is far more important than where you were spatially. That is, where you lived, where you live now, or with what people, animals, plants, or landscape you share. In fact, the latter is utterly inconsequential. The most important thing in the world in this Christianized way of thinking is to allow yourself to be moved toward maturity. It is precisely this commitment to a life aimed at maturity that joined visions of salvation to ideas of the transformation of lands and peoples. Whiteness, sisters and brothers, whiteness formed at this joining. From the beginning of colonialism, salvation and the transformation of land and people have been coupled together, and that coupling turned Christianity's creative powers against itself. Christian faith is about new life in Christ and forming life inside that newness. That is the truth. We know that, right? Now, the new situation of colonial power enfolded the newness that is Christian faith within the newness that was the transformation of land and people, earth and animal. Now, we need precision here to see the problem. The problem is not that things change. Things change. We could even say things evolve. Nor is the problem the impulse to transform. Transformation is not inherently evil. The horror here is the denial of voice and vision of people who inhabit place in ways that deny the logics of life together in a place as the basic wisdom that should form shape, that should form change and transformation. The horror here is the emergence of a form of creating that destroys creation. A form of creating that destroys creation. This is not the logic of breaking eggs to make omelets. That is, recognizing that some destruction is always inherent in creation. That's not the logic here. The logic here destroys the life of chickens by distorting their bodies to maximize egg production. This logic drives creation toward death. So this is where we are. Death began with denying the voice of peoples and the voice of the earth. that is, the earth's own semiotic reality, and in doing this to render people's identities bound to place inconsequential. Death expanded its reach through designating peoples and the earth in reductive categories, isolating lives and life into fragments in order to make them more useful. That is, to turn everything into commodities. We were then taught to project meaning onto our lives and to life itself, now formed in fragments. And we learned to reassemble life as interchangeable, exchangeable, and connectable bodies, buildings, goods, and services. This is us. And we have remained on this trajectory, and it set in place the processes of transformation that captured the energy and logic of Christian conversion and placed it inside whiteness as a formation toward maturity. So if you have not followed this, let me state it clearly. No one is born white. Do not tell children that. No one is born white. There is no white biology. But whiteness is real. Whiteness is a working, a forming toward a maturity that destroys. Whiteness is an invitation to a form of agency and a subjectivity that imagines life progressing toward what is, in fact, a diseased understanding of maturity, a maturity that invites us to evaluate the entire world by how far along it is toward this goal. White agency and subjectivity, whiteness, forms as people imagine themselves being transformed and moving toward maturity in three fundamental ways. Moving from being owned to being an owner, from being a stranger to being a citizen, and from being identified with darkness to being seen as white. Now, it should be clear at this point that anyone can enter white agency and white subjectivity. That is, anyone can be white, friends. Anyone can be white. Anybody can step on the path, the trajectory toward whiteness. Whiteness is not exclusive. It is inclusive. Come on, come on. We can all be white. Now, if I had time, I would go into more details about the three trajectories, but my time is coming to an end. So, my time is coming to an end. So, let me press on then, and then when we get these published, you'll be able to see the more details. But let me press on to the reality of this, the feeling of whiteness. You see, the difficulty we face at this moment is the success of this work. Whiteness feels normal and natural. It feels normal and natural because it is woven into how we imagine moving toward maturity. Whiteness, of course, right now, as many of you know, is being questioned at this moment like never before. And it feels terrible to so many people. We have to talk about whiteness in relationship to affect and feeling, because how whiteness feels is how whiteness thinks. If you don't remember anything else, remember that. How whiteness feels is how whiteness thinks. Agency and subjectivity form in how we feel and think as one reality of personhood. So the questioning of whiteness feels terrible in two ways to many people. First, it feels as if we are abandoning the goal of progress. And secondly, it feels as if we are becoming obsessed with matters of identity and loss, and losing matters of identity, and we've lost a sense of common purpose. It feels as if we are abandoning the goal of progress because we have been led to believe that the way life has formed over the colonial centuries is the only viable way that remains open to us. Some argue strongly that the denial of indigenous primitivisms, the necessary reductionism inherent in scientific investigation, the commodification, fragmentation, and the reassembling of life into products for exchange, they are all necessary for modern economies. And there have been some bad consequences and collateral damage, people will say. But look at all that has been produced and continues to be produced thanks to the transforming of the new worlds. Ownership, nations, and productive labor are all good and necessary things. The way things have formed is a sign of maturity, they contend. Yet what is at stake here for so many people is a defense of a maturity that is not maturity at all, but the defense of a vision that has left them with no other path that can look backward and forward. They are forced to minimize the horrors of the past and maximize the accomplishments of the present and live with a highly constrained imagination for what is possible. It is a terrible thing to be with Christians who cannot imagine a different possibility. Those who have become uncomfortable with the question of whiteness also feel as though we have become obsessed with matters of identity and have lost a sense of common purpose. There is a sense in which whiteness is invisible, not because it cannot be seen, but because the point was never to see it, but to live life and perform life toward it. It was only when you resist that performance that you can actually start to see it. But people have always resisted it from the very beginning. People have always resisted the loss of a life and place, resisted being designated racially, resisted their lives being commodified, resisted being forced to live inside a global system of exchange, debt, and money, and resisted as long as they could the relentless systems of education and evaluation that supported these things. And they did it by drawing on the only tool they had available: their identities. So as I close, because I only have 2 minutes left, Lord have mercy, maybe 2.5, and maybe I can take 20 seconds afterwards. But as I close, what we need at this moment is a Christian faith that can start to break our deep connection to whiteness by resisting its vision of maturity. In the time I have left, all I can do is suggest a first step. That's all I can do. But the first step is the most important. The paths that have been formed by whiteness, carved on the earth, and in the bodies these paths cannot be undone, but they can be redirected, drawn into new paths that lead away from death and into life. You see, it all begins with the land. I said it before, it all begins with dirt. It begins with air, water, cities, towns, neighborhoods, and homes. It all begins with new kinds of intentional communities that challenge where people live and how people live in places. So as I close, I want to double down on what some people know and feel but are afraid to say. It all comes down to geography and living spaces. Whiteness comes to rest in space. Whiteness always comes to rest in space. The maturity whiteness aims at always forms segregated spaces. It forms lives lived in parallel, whether separated by miles or inches. It constructs bordered life lived in separate endeavors of wish fulfillment. Segregated spaces must be turned toward living spaces where people construct together an everyday that turns life in healthy directions. You see, overcoming whiteness begins by reconfiguring life geographically so that all the flows work differently. The flows of money and education, of support and attention, move across people who have been separated by the processes that have formed us racially, economically, and nationally. We start with the communities that have been left behind in the movement toward maturity. Those no longer imagined through the goals of ownership, citizenship, or productive labor. And we join them, we move to them, we stay in them, we form them, and we advocate for them, or we protect them. We go to the places that people have abandoned, and we start over there. We fight against the segregation that shapes our worlds, and we follow and we work to weave lives together. Remember, this is only the first step, and there are many more that must follow. But what I'm saying to you, the point not to be missed, is that we should feel compelled to form what Gerhard Lofing called a long time ago a contrast society in small places. So I am advocating compelling people to live together across all the lines of formation toward whiteness that divide us and have habituated us to be comfortable with those divides. Yes, I want people to move. Yes, I want people to sell homes and move. I want people to move together. Yes, I want to change the geography, because that is the only way. That is the only way to remove us from this vision, this trajectory toward death. And most importantly, I want to save people from becoming white. Thank you.
Over the last several days, I've had a chance to meditate on this talk, and as I've done so, the first response that I have to make is simply that I really just want to be silent, because I actually think that what has been distilled in this lecture is so extraordinary and exquisitely important, urgent and compelling, demanding and encompassing, that I just want to be quiet in front of it. It names things that are named by others in important and truthful ways, but it names things in ways that it seems to me puts its finger on things that not only I, but I think we, many we's in this room, really need to hear and really need to grapple with and understand. And so I first want to respond really by simply calling myself into silence, and you as well. I'd encourage you to sit with this for a long time. But it also doesn't make me want to just remain silent. It actually makes me want to say nothing, because it compels me to feel that the only thing that's worth doing is something that's more active. Words seem silly and ridiculous in the face of what we've just heard. It's about action. It's not because words don't matter or the reflection doesn't matter or that other kinds of responses might be possible. But in the end, the kind of thing that's being named by what Dr. Jennings has so helpfully outlined and even more expansively described in the full paper is really something to which action is really the primary response. Action that claims and lives into geography and space and bodies and locations and neighborhoods and communities. This is really acutely true because I happen to be president of a theological institution, and I'm a tall white male. My own gut tells me to act and otherwise just shut up. It's not enough to talk, nor even to try to understand. It's about dismantling something. It's about dismantling whiteness. It's about dismantling white supremacy and being part of a diverse community that actually remakes this and, I hope, many other institutions as well. This is really no discrete task, however. It involves the dismantling of many things. It's not simply one thing. In this case, let's say Fuller Theological Seminary. It involves the dismantling of forms of the academy that are considered sacred. It involves facing collisions between various academic guilds and competitors of different kinds. They may be intellectual, they may be moral or philosophical, There may be institutional churches or ministries or ethnicities or cultures, and it's always and ever live theater. It's the only way that it can be done. There's no place for stasis. There's no place for rest or escape. There's no conflict-free zone. You can't do this without pain, without suffering, and without loss. There's no place for an easy kind of common agreement. All naive expectations about some kind of easily achieved shalom have to be in some way reordered, shattered, left in disarray, until sufficient quiet and agreement and readiness together has been created in order to necessarily come to a new future. It does not mean eliminating tension. It actually involves redistributing it. And it is what must be done against the backdrop, not least of 500 plus years of doing everything to control and justify and dominate through whiteness. It is what must be done. And I want to do in this season, for example, for me, in my own current role, as much as possible toward making a way for the whiteness of Fuller Seminary to be dismantled. This is not some kind of institutional goal. This is not something which is done as a result of some kind of resolution someplace. This is the work of actually just engaging reality actually as it is, as opposed to as it appears. This is what the resistance that Dr. Jennings is talking about requires. It means letting the resistance expose the evidence of the whiteness that a place like Fuller would protest as part of its past, but in doing so often simply deny the reality that has truly, deeply, profoundly shaped us. This is to work consistently towards a kind of decoupling of what Dr. Jennings has argued is the destructive, cataclysmic fusion between the gospel and what it means to be white. So this is part of how I respond. Another part of how I respond is that it simply makes me overwhelmingly and deeply sad. This is not what I think is sometimes thought of as white guilt. There's plenty of that to go around, and I have certainly experienced my share of that. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a deep sadness, a sadness that is like a groaning of creation, that groans under what we've been hearing about tonight. It's why, in a way, it's a benchmark of the kind of death toward which whiteness can so often lead, because it is a groaning, a denial of the trajectory and vitality of creation itself. And frankly, it can seem at times so engulfing, so traumatizing, so disabling, so bleak, that it's hard to imagine another kind of reality. This is exactly, of course, why the Christian gospel is needed. But when the Christian gospel is taken hostage by a completely different kind of fusion, with an energy and a vision and a pattern which actually subverts the very gospel, that makes it so much less that it is literally rendered impotent, which is at least one way of measuring the current state of the church in America. That is an extraordinary tragedy. It brings me to my own version of the problem of evil. Classically stated as, if God is all good and all powerful, why does evil exist? My version of that problem is this: if God is all good and all powerful, why is the church so unchanged? Let alone, why does the church, not least the white church, perpetuate and contribute to, if not sufficiently repent of its initiating role in the dominating abuse of power, failing to seek what it would mean to live into the new community that is meant to be the kingdom of God? Faithful worship has always been about reordering power. That's why worship is our only life-giving source. It is the thing that actually rescues us. It redeems us to be reminded in corporate and private, spontaneous, public, and personal ways that we bow before the one who alone is the source of life, and let all other power, all other kinds and claims to life be reordered by the reality of that God. all forms of power need to be reordered. Every kind of power needs to be reordered. My power needs to be reordered. My institutional power needs to be reordered. It is part of the claim of what the Christian gospel in the world is actually meant to do. It's the thing that actually the scriptures call being set free. The exquisite title of the question of this address, Can White People Be Saved?, is really the perfect way to capture the horrific irony of the colonialist project. In its most vigorous inception, the question was probably the opposite. Can any besides white people be saved? But now, as that project has played itself out toward death, it actually has been flipped. And the question becomes, no, can white people be saved? Not white people, but white or other kinds of people who live inside whiteness. Now, the bankruptcy of that project does what human violence always does, which is inevitably reveal that violence is self-abusive from the start, and it will always eventually show itself. So buried in the madness and arrogance of this colonialist vision was the failure to see its own demise. It was precisely the tension of Nebuchadnezzar, on the one hand, having a horrific vision so horrific that he needed special authority to have spiritual insight into its meaning in Daniel chapter 2, and then blithely in chapter 3, builds his own nightmare and asks for all those in the kingdom to bow down before it. Is this so far from the way that the colonialist vision, now thought of as the whiteness vision, has continued to exist? I'm deeply moved by what we've heard tonight, and I'm in agreement with what has been said, if not, in fact, really intense agreement. What I want to do is to underscore the opening assumption regarding the inextricable connection between colonial, which tonight I want to call whiteness, colonial power or whiteness, and the Christian gospel. This fusion, this is not inferential, but explicit, and it takes shape from the time when the doctrine of discovery was initiated in the 15th century all the way to today, in the way the most ordinary interpersonal and systemic dynamics of power play out against the reality of the way in which our lives are held captive by this kind of racialized power that conjoins the gospel to the thing that itself is the source of destruction. If there's anything that I tried to convey at the time that I was being considered to become the president of Fuller, it was that I saw the American church, not least the American church, but the American church in a season of unbelievable crisis, that its identity and its very claims to any sort of truth, let alone any sort of genuine good news, was actually at stake. That in fact, if there was going to be a church in the 21st century, it would have to be a church that would be remade. It would have to emerge, especially when we're thinking of the white church. It would have to be a church literally revived. It would require a kind of theological and personal revival in order to bring the reality of the gospel to have any kind of authentic witness in a culture where the issues of race and racialization have so distorted the gospel that the capacity for the truth and mercy and justice of Jesus Christ to show itself seems at times almost impossible to imagine. This is why we end up finding ourselves in a moment like this, where in fact the American church, not least the American evangelical church, is so radically divided, where in fact the social paradigms are so utterly distinct that the capacity to be able to find unity, something that we would call unity in Christ, is, it seems, almost impossible to imagine. Is it because we're actually thinking of a different Christ? Is it because we have a different image of the very one that we both claim is Savior? And it's not just both as though it is one and not the other, it's an array, but in that spectrum, where do we allow for the deep revival of heart and mind and spirit, and especially in Dr. Jennings' closing comments about renewed communities across different kinds of lines and connectedness, is the core of our transformation. My own work in this area, which is an existential work, has gone on since I was a little boy. in the context of two homesteading families, one in Oregon and one in Washington, where the land mattered in every way to our family, where the sense of physicality of the earth, the dirt, was absolutely a part of my childhood. And though I was raised in a white family, my parents had exceptional instincts to think that it really mattered that I grew up in a context like that, but actually had friends that were part of Yakima Nation and knew families that were immigrant families that came to our valley to work in the fruit industry. But that trajectory went on to a surprising degree when I became a Christian. That didn't happen for me until I was in college. In the context of that process, my dad, who was a wonderful father and saved certain neck veins for the discussion of religion, really wanted to make sure that his two sons, if at all possible, did everything they could to have nothing to do with religion and religious devotion. You can see this didn't turn out too well for him. But his critique is very much at the core of what we're talking about tonight. His anxiety was that what religion does is that it takes great things and it makes them very small. And it was his hope that his sons would have a sense of the imagination of the world, the beauty and splendor and reach of the world, the diversity of the world, the capacity of the world to be discovered, not in the sense of claiming and owning, but actually just having your heart and mind widened by the reality of that. I started reading the Gospels, and I was stunned as I entered college to discover that Jesus and my dad had so much in common. This would not have been my impression. I thought that pastors were neurotic, and certainly their children were. But what did shock me even more was the discovery that Jesus' antidote was so dramatically different than the one that my father had, which was not about the avoidance of religion. It was about the discovery of the kingdom of God, which cracks open reality, but not an imaginative reality or a reality above the earth, so much as a reality in the earth, in the context of a life and a kingdom that is meant to enact and display and make clear a reality that is so much bigger than the small, pathetic whiteness that our lives could so easily be caught in. It would be a pathetic tragedy if Fuller Seminary and other Christian institutions like it were to simply stay trapped in that small box, instead of actually understanding that the character of what we're about is something so much deeper and so much richer and so much more important than that small little enterprise.
Well, we have quite a ride. Why don't we begin, Dr. Jennings, you responding to Mark however you think appropriate, and then we continue the conversation.
Well, I want to thank Mark for those fabulous comments and the vulnerability he showed as president of the most important, the most important seminary in the world.
Amen.
It's a rare thing to have a seminary president speak about whiteness in the way he did. So very much appreciate that, Mark. And I hope all faculty, staff, and students present will recognize that. It is difficult because for so many people, I used to, and Dr. Sechrest knows this from many years ago, for so many people, these things have been so woven together, their Christianity, their Christian identity, and their whiteness. And I would sometimes write the word white on the board, and I would touch the board, and I would say to the students, I'm not touching you, I'm touching the word white. But there'd actually be some students who they would flinch when I did that because so identified with that word, and we understand that identification, we must remember that identification was hard won. Becoming white in America was an achievement. To strip, if I would have had time, I would have talked about the stripping away of immigrant identity and the taking on of whiteness. That's how people survived. And we forget that to our peril. For so many people, to be an immigrant is to be a stranger, and you don't want to stay in the space of the stranger. So as quickly as you can, remove yourself from the pain of being the stranger, you will do that. So whiteness is not just an act of hubris. To step on the path is a step on the path for survival for so many people.
Thank you very much. There are several questions that can be tied together, but there's one that I want to prioritize. How does gender interact with your definition of whiteness?
Yes. The move toward maturity is the move toward being a mature man. There's no doubt about that. It is to be able, I'm working on a small book for theological education. The fundamental problem we face within, we didn't talk about education because couldn't fit that in with given everything else going on. But one of the fundamental problem we face is that most higher education in America is shaped inside one trajectory: the formation of us all into self-sufficient men. And so masculinity stands at the end of the accomplishment of maturity. To be able to stand self-sufficiently, independently, knowing your own voice. We give other kinds of clothing to this, but in truth, it's a beautiful masculinity that's very seductive. And just like anyone can be white, anybody can be a man. It's not just men who can be men. And not just white men who are pressed into a persona, because it is a persona. It's not, it's not the actuality of it. It can be, but it's a persona. But anybody can step inside that persona. And the tragedy is for so many people, they don't know it's a persona. They think it's what God created.
And how will femininity interact as maleness that you have described?
Well, let's be a little careful. Masculinity and femininity, we don't want to, let's just make it simple. We don't want to harden them into things. What we want to recognize is that calling into question masculinity is calling into question various ways in which it has been narrated and shaped for people to enter. Just like femininity, we want to call into question, as I like to say, we want to call into question all the storytellers in the world that want to tell us through story what it means to be human, and who then demand the gospel to fit into their story of what it means to be human, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. I grew up in the Northeast, in the Midwest, in Michigan. I live in the Northeast now, excuse me, it was a Freudian slip there. But like many kids, I had football coaches and all those coaches in high school, and my coaches were hideous people. Not because they meant to be hideous, but because they had a very clear idea of what a man was. And all the little boys who didn't fit into that, the pain and the horror of not fitting, and the men who felt so proud that they fit, but in the moment of fitting, they lost all sense of who they were. They just never knew it. So thank God for those men and for those women who have pushed back against the confines of gender identity and who say day after day, I am not that, and I'm not going to be that. It's too bad that too many Christians are uncomfortable with people who push back like that.
Would you like to comment before we move to the next?
I think that narrative storytelling is one way of explaining why Christian movies are so bad. What I mean by that really is simply that there is a kind of stereotyping and type scripting that feels so preset. And part of the reason it rings often, has tragically, painfully rung so often shallowly, is that it is not an account of a vital humanity. How can we represent an incarnational God and not do a better job understanding what it means to be human? So that is our crisis. That's part of the human crisis. But it's, and given that it's a complex task for anyone, I think the kinds of things that you're describing are a piece of that.
Now, Dr. Jennings, you entice us to move into a new space and to create new communities.
Yes.
Over half the questions are one way or another of asking the how to.
But
let me put the question in this manner.
Mm-hmm.
Would you care to describe a first-person knowledge of any one of these communities and how it came about and how have you experienced it?
Well, there are communities all over the country, all over the world where this is happening. Some are the more celebrated, intentional communities, but I'm also thinking about the little small places where communities have been abandoned, but there are still people there. People who don't have jobs, people who are trying to eke out a living. And as I was saying today at lunch, folks who've rediscovered gardens, folks who are, from various parts of the world bringing their knowledges, indigenous knowledges in many cases, of how to garden again. People who are taking what little bit they have and sharing, and who are slowly in spaces where capital has ignored them, forgotten about them. There's no Starbucks, no Best Buy, no Home Depot. They're slowly trying to figure out how to piece together life together because they have to. There's no cameras, no CNN, no PBS watching them, but they're doing it, right? It's those little spaces. The first step, sisters and brothers, is to do what we have been trained not to do. Pay attention to the dirt, to land. We Christians are geographically adrift. This is why most Christians I know have no doctrine of creation. We say we believe in creation, but it means absolutely nothing in the way we live. We know nothing about the places we live. We know nothing about the histories there. We don't know flows. We don't understand space at all. And the first step is to understand space. What existed in the place before your house, your school, what was there? Who lives around you? How do the traffic flows? Where are the sidewalks? Where are the not sidewalks? These basic things that of all people, Christians are some of the worst people for not knowing anything that's going on around them. Especially their churches. They think what's going on inside the church is far more important than where the church is in the first place. A church that doesn't attend to geography, whatever's going on inside of it is vapid and superficial. Just that simple.
Well, ground that a little more in your stories about the importance of gardening. I just think that's such a critical thing in your own formation.
Yeah, I was telling a story to someone just yesterday. These memories come back to me these days. One of my mother's practices, she was a fabulous gardener learned her gardening from being in the South, being a sharecropper, picking cotton every year for someone else. So when she moved north, she had a garden, and every spring when in Michigan, when the weather turned, and when you knew when you can go into your garden. She knew when she could go into her garden because those birds returned, the ones that had left. The squirrels started acting differently because squirrels act differently when it starts to get warm. So she would always pay attention to that. I didn't know these things. She knew these things. The squirrels, and then some of those plants that grow only when they know it's time to grow, she would watch that. Then she'd come out and she'd clear her garden, take up all the weeds. And then what she would do, I'm sorry, I'll be quick, I'm sorry. But
I was trying to tell you to hold the mic.
Oh, sorry. So, and then what she would do is that when she'd clear all the weeds and all the old stuff out, and it'd just be dirt. She would wet all the dirt. You gardeners know this. She would wet all the dirt, and it would be mud, this rich, deep, black mud. And my mother would stand out there in the middle, and she said, "Boy, come on out here, come on out here." I was always on the side with the seed. I didn't want to go out in the mud. She said, "Come on out here, come on out here." And she would come out and say, "Okay, now get on your knees with me. Stick your hands deep into the dirt." I said, "Oh, God, I got to do this, Mom." Yes, stick your hands deep into the dirt. And she would have her hands deep in there, and she'd make me stick my hands deep into the dirt. And she would say, "Leave it there. You feel that? You hear that?" I didn't hear and feel nothing. Nothing. But later on, I understood what she was trying to make me hear and feel. The earth. And to feel and hear myself. Maybe the first step, sisters and brothers, is for wherever you are, wherever you live, to go find a garden, and when the season starts, get people who you don't like, go out into the garden before you start to put the seed in. It's very important. Wet it, and then maybe you and that person or people stick your hands, your arms down into the dirt together. Look at each other and ask yourselves, do you feel that? Do you hear that? See, my life begins with people putting their hands in dirt and recognizing that this is what joins us. This is inescapable.
Do you remember the smell? You said you did not feel anything, but did you smell something?
Well, dirt has a beautiful smell. Dirt itself has a beautiful smell. Some of the other stuff that's there doesn't, but dirt has a beautiful smell. And those of you who garden, wet dirt is beautiful.
If you were to think of metaphors of social interaction, for the sticking the hands on the dirt, about 1/3 of the question had to do with that. People thinking of how does it translate to structures within the church, the institution.
Can you say more? I think I'm following you, but I just want to make sure.
The idea of what am I supposed to do at church? Seeing the church as the center and as a place where action will happen to transform and create these communities. What are the 1, 2, 3 steps to follow?
Okay. You want to take a stab at that? The 1, 2, 3 steps.
We're smelling the ground. We're smelling the dirt, but we're thinking of how.
This is always the difficult question. Where to begin? And I was trying to suggest some things a moment ago of where to begin. Here's where we are right now. We live in very segregated spaces that we don't think a lot about. And so I think one of probably the most important things a church can do is to start to ask some very basic questions about why are we here in this place as a church? Why is this church, are we here just because we got a good deal on the land? Is there some Holy Spirit reason why we're here? And what is God saying to me about where I live in relationship to where I worship? And so I want to just keep it very basic, because part of the difficulty is that we run from this very first question. The first question is, we flow, we kind of go with geographic and economic flows to live wherever we can afford, whatever's possible. And we never stop to think about questions of discipleship with place. Remember in the book of Acts, here's the thing about the book of Acts, as you all know. Almost nobody in the book of Acts is doing what they want to do.
Can you tell us more?
No, almost everybody in the book of Acts is being compelled by the Spirit to go where they don't want to go. The sign of the Spirit's presence is not, oh, I'm so thankful you're here. It's like, I don't want to go there. That's the sign of the Spirit's presence. Think about it. In fact, I don't know if there's anybody who says, yes, I'll go. I want to go do what you want, Spirit. They're all like, can you get somebody else? Of course, my favorite is Ananias, who has to go to Saul. And, the Spirit says you have to go. And then he says, rumor has it, did you tell God the rumors that this man's a killer? I don't know if God knows that, but I don't think God would have sent me to a killer. Yeah.
Do you think God will be sending us today to other souls that have been transformed into Pauls?
I think the reality of the Holy Spirit's presence, especially in this church in the country, is that the fundamental reality is that we are resisting the Spirit. And I think the fundamental reality is that we have especially resisted the Spirit in thinking about place where we live in geography. We have had no serious thinking in terms of discipleship in relationship to real estate, in relationship to developers, in relationship to land. We've had no serious discipleship in thinking about those things. We have allowed the entire world to be a part of economic calculation and not gospel calculation. That's the bottom line for us. We resist the Spirit saying, stop being quiet when it comes to how communities are formed, how neighborhoods are formed, how, when I go places and lecture, I always say the most important ethical meeting that happens in any community is when the city commissioners meet once or twice a month, and they sit there and there's nobody out there in the audience, and they're deciding on price points for homes. They're deciding on where streets will, where bus routes will run. These are deep moral issues, and we are not there. And so I would much prefer to talk about Christians going to those meetings than talking about what we're doing in the church. Because if we're not at those meetings, I really don't care what you're doing in the church, because you're not making any difference. If you are not talking about where buses run, where sidewalks are and where they're not, I don't care what you're talking about in the church, because you're not making any difference to people who can only ride buses. You're not in the room. But you want to bring them into your church, but you're not in the room. I'm sorry, I'm fussing now. Forgive me. Fussing.
We're feeling it. Give us the 30 seconds of wisdom on that more. Are you thinking of cooperatives, financial movement?
Yes. I want to begin with knowledge. So I'm repeating myself now, but I want to begin with knowledge. I want everyone here in this room to find out when your city commissioners meet to discuss bus routes, housing, price points, real estate, and I want every Christian here to go to those meetings. And I want you to learn how your cities function, how your towns function. And I want you to push against the segregation that is built inside economic segregation. I want you to fight and argue about where people are allowed to live, where people can't live, about housing, about fair housing. I want you to be there pushing as hard as you possibly can, because when you do that, you'll start to address whiteness.
Dr. Labberton, would you like to have some final words?
I think the thing I want to say is that when I think about the people that are here tonight and the fact that they live all over the world, many of them live in contexts completely outside the U.S., as well as those of us that live inside the U.S., and the sense of place varies so much, right? Even today, the places that have been spoken about by the people that have spoken from the platform are people that occupy different spaces. And I guess just speak a little bit more about how does a person come into space and weigh it in the way that you're describing? What's happening?
Everywhere that private property has become a new reality, everywhere where people are being taught to look out at their world through calculation and commodification, they're losing their world. So whether it's here or someplace else, or other parts of the world, if you are inside those calculations, and if they are being mapped on top of, old forms of segregation, as the dear brother talked about this morning, the caste system, if they're inside old forms, the question of discipleship, I think, is not simply how you should live, but where you should live, and how you should rethink your life in a place. That's what I want people to do, to really start to think about the placement of discipleship. If the incarnation teaches us anything, is that God cares about place. It's not inconsequential. And unfortunately, I think for so many people, it has become inconsequential for us. Which again, I think means I'm not sure the world really matters to us.
So the church is not a building, but an activity in the world, in the community.
Brilliant. Brilliant actor.
I think it's time to end. But I cannot do that without telling you that the three of us happen to be the babies in our family. As we celebrate that, we celebrate with Dr. Amos Young and Dr. Love L. Sechrest, and of course myself. I was reminded to include myself here. We like to thank you all for attending today's lecture. We also want to send a special thank you to our live stream audience. Look at the camera. And thank you to our speakers. It doesn't say to look to the speakers, but I will do that. We hope we will see you back tomorrow at 9 a.m. when we are listening Andrea Smith present Indigenizing Salvation. So from Whiteness to Indigenizing. See you tomorrow at 9 a.m. We shall finish with a word of prayer.
Johnny, just before that,
Please.
I just want to say to people that tonight has been a great example of why I think Fuller matters and why having someone like Willie Jennings here is such a gift. And I want to be sure that you know that it is a great honor and delight to me to know that he's going to be joining our Board of Trustees and is going to be a voice of this kind in our Board of Trustees. So thank you very much.
We will end with a word of prayer.
Oh God, we just cry out to you again in silence and in sadness and in hope. The hope is frankly sometimes very hard to come by for all the reasons that we've talked about today. the reasons that can so easily cause us to get stuck in places that bring death and not life. So we cry out to you as the God who has the capacity to bring life into places that are dead. You specialize in that very thing. And so we turn to you tonight in that hope and confidence, not because of what we can do. And yet we also turn to what we can do and what we must do as people who are seeking to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen.